So this is Matthew chapter 13, the scripture for the 11th of August. Now in this third great discourse in Matthew's gospel, remember, 5 great discourses. You've got the Sermon on the Mount, 5 to 7. You've got Matthew 10, which is the commissioning. You've got this chapter, Matthew 13. This is where Jesus introduces parables. Then you've got chapter 18, which is where Jesus talks about the Holy Community. And finally, an indictment on the religious leaders in chapter 23 to 25. So this here is where Jesus begins to speak in parables. Now, Matthew has 23 parables, 7 of which come in rapid fire in this chapter. Jesus begins with the parable of the sower, which is perhaps, one of his more well-known parables. It's an early parable across the Gospels. Now, parables are excellent literary devices because they're not allegories. If you take nothing else from this, take that. They're not allegories. They're often too complex to be allegorical. A parable is a story that you can kind of turn in the light, sort of like you would a diamond, and see through it through different facets and see something different each time. And Jesus tells parables in part because the truths of heaven require a sort of profound simplicity that you can't get with a short story where everything's laid out, and you also can't get with a poem. You got to have something in between, and parables are like poetic short stories. Parables have this profound simplicity, and they're also living. While Jesus interprets 2 parables in this chapter, offering some sort of a canonical interpretation, both of these interpretations serve to open the parable up to further study, as opposed to close it down. So take the parable of the sower, for example. The parable, on the one hand, is about the lavishness of God. God tosses seed wherever. And God doesn't care where it lands. So be it. Seed can go in the path, seed can go among the rocks, among the weeds, or it can go in the good soil. And regardless of where it lands, I'm going to keep tossing out the seed because God is lavish with the love that God has and with the good news. God shares himself with anyone and everyone. But this parable also tells us how we ought to bear witness. We need to be lavish with this gospel that we have, as lavish as God is, and throw the seed of our witness to the gospel anywhere that we go. But this parable is also about how we need to tend to the soil in our own hearts, how we can always improve the grounds in which the gospel takes root, whether we need to get deeper soil or weed out the weeds, or maybe we need to get soil that instead of producing 30-fold produces 100-fold. We can always improve our own hearts. Jesus quotes Isaiah when he's asked why he speaks in parables. And this quote happens immediately after God calls Isaiah, right after God touches a live coal taken from the altar of heaven, touches it to Isaiah's lips. The things of heaven, what this is saying is that the things of heaven must be shared carefully. That Jesus' lips, much as Isaiah's were, have been consecrated to God, and so he speaks the very words of God. And as he says earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, we don't take pearls and throw them before swine. And so only those who've been touched by God really can access these parables. More parables occur in this chapter. You have the parable of the weeds, which tells us, among other things, that we will never in this lifetime be able to draw a clear line between the true believers on the one hand and those who are pretending on the other hand. The Greek word here for weed refers to a specific type of weed that resembles, it looks very similar to wheat. And so the kingdom of heaven will consist of, as we lead up to the kingdom of heaven, it'll consist of wheat living alongside weeds. And we got to learn to live with that. It's worth investing, though, in growing toward the kingdom of heaven, since it will overtake everything, much as the mustard seed does when it sprouts into the bush, much as the leaven does as it goes throughout the bread. There's nowhere that's safe from the lordship of Jesus Christ when the kingdom of heaven comes. In verses 44 and 45, Jesus speaks of the overwhelming value of the kingdom of heaven. It's worth giving up everything you have to obtain this. And those who pursued it will be separated from those who didn't at the end of all things. When Jesus tells this parable of those who, the fish who are separated, which is very similar to the parable of the weeds. Somehow, the disciples claim to understand all this. I'm not quite sure how. I don't know if I understand all this. So then, upon returning to Nazareth, Jesus is evidently seen as too big for his britches. With all this wisdom and highfalutin stuff that he has, the people of Nazareth expected to continue seeing him as their precocious young man, the one they could be proud of because he represents, his hometown proud. But when he condemns them and suggests they've got room to grow, they have an issue with that. Jesus is not content to be owned simply by one town. I wonder, what value do you place on the kingdom of heaven? That's all for Matthew 13. Tomorrow, the 12th of August, we'll look at Matthew chapter 14. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.